Hello everyone, my name is John Mishler and I'm going to walk you through this presentation on chapter 37 about soil and plant nutrition. And I'm going to go pretty quickly through a lot of this, so you may want to pause on some of the slides with more text and read it for yourself. So, let's get started. So, farmland productivity. We worry about farmland productivity because we want to grow vegetables to feed ourselves and the world, and we have to deal with a bunch of different deficiencies and issues within our farmlands and our soils in order to be able to grow the food we need. And by growing the food, I mean plants taking carbon out of the atmosphere, um, using photosynthesis and building their components, which some of those components, like for instance the root on a carrot, we eat. So, how do we help plants build biomass that we need to sustain ourselves? And I'm just going to mention that there's a bunch of environmental issues associated with us not treating the soil very well. We can make a bunch of management decisions that can contribute to things like huge amounts of windborne erosion, like you're seeing here. So, the upper layer of soil is the most important part, and it's what we're going to be talking about mostly both in this lecture and in class. So, and it's actually extremely complex. Living organisms, physical properties, chemical properties all play a role in the soil's ability to maintain plant growth. And so we'll start talking about the physical properties of soil. One of those physical properties is soil texture. It involves relative proportions of sand, silt, and clay. And of course, like what we've been talking about, topsoil is the most important layer of soil, and the humus is an important component of the topsoil, mainly dead and decaying organic matter. You can see this here in the soil profile. This A horizon is what's containing most of your organic material, and you can see it's nice, dark, black, rich. That's containing most of your organic matter, which is where a lot of the action is happening as far as nutrient cycling and plants being able to get a hold of those nutrients they need to grow. Um, so plants also need water to grow, and depending on what kind of soil you have, clay, silt, sand, that can affect how water moves through the soil. And if you want, so your best sort of all-purpose soil is going to be your loams, and that contains equal amounts of sand, silt, and clay. So a little bit of each makes the best kind of soil. And like I mentioned, we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at the topsoil, and it contains both inorganic and organic constituents. So, our inorganic components of the topsoil are things like cations, and those are going to be sticking to soil because the soil is negatively charged, so these cations that are positively charged are going to be sticking to the soil, and because they're sticking to the soil, you can't actually remove them from the system just by flushing water through it, which is called leaching. You would have to actually erode those pieces of soil in order to get these cations out of there. And so sometimes plants want to actually get at these cations that are associated with the soil. And so what they'll do is release positive cations out into the soil water solution, out into the pore spaces, and so those positive cations will replace other positive cations that are on the soil, and those positive cations that came off the soil will come to the plant, and the plant will be able to get those. So plants are able to actually change the local environment around them in order to get to some of these positive cations that they're wanting to get to. So humus builds soil into sort of a crumbly texture, and it retains water, which is great because you want soil that has water available throughout the year. but it's still porous. So porous means that there's actually air pockets within the soil, and that's also important because you don't want your plants to be surrounded in water. You're going to drown them and kill them. They need to have access to sort of these open pores as well. So it's important for a bunch of different reasons. Um, Not least of those is as a habitat for the bacteria, fungi, algae, protists, insects, earthworms, and all sorts of organisms that call the topsoil home, and these decomposers, which we'll talk about more in class and a little bit more here. But a bunch of these organisms are particularly important for nutrient cycling in the soil. And just a just sort of an aside, and we're gonna talk more about this in class too. But a lot of agricultural systems are actually depleting the soils and important minerals and water. And so sustainable ag is finding a way that we can farm a single piece of land for not 10 years, not 50 years, not 100 years, but thousands of years. And this is not a big deal here in Pennsylvania, but irrigation can also be a huge issue. We usually pull irrigation water from underground aquifers, which are just rocks that are full of water, like a sponge is full of water. And when you pull too much water out of these too quickly, you end up getting subsidence, and so you end up getting the ground level dropping. Irrigation can also lead to salinization. So just like the ocean water is salty, when you irrigate land and the water evaporates away, you leave behind the salts. And so if you irrigate for long enough, you can actually build these salts up, and you won't be able to grow on the land anymore. Now, a big a big a big part of a lot of farming operations is fertilization. So fertilization means basically you need to put the nitrogen, phosphorus, and other minerals back into the land that you took off when you harvested your crop and sent it somewhere else. So the food that we're eating, those nutrients came out of the soil somewhere. And so because we're not replacing those nutrients after we eat it, we're not taking our manure and spreading it back onto that field. The farmers need to find a different way in order to fertilize that plot. And so the main ways we fertilize are by commercial fertilizers that are basically using fossil fuels to make nitrogen come out of the atmosphere into a form that plants can use, and also digging up phosphorus and potassium is also important for plant growth. And organic fertilizers like manure, fish meal, compost. And soil pH is also really important and affects a lot of processes within the soil. And if the soil pH starts going one way or the other, that we end up not liking it, then we can apply ground up limestone to our soil if our soil is too acidic, and it can bring the pH back up to where we need to be. And erosion is a huge deal in farmland. So when you lose topsoil, soil takes a very long time, hundreds, thousands, even 100,000 years sometimes for soils to form. And when you lose these soils through wind or water, if you're tilling the soil and exposed to the elements, you're losing it. You can't get that soil back. Soil is a finite thing, and so it's really important that we can control erosion, keep those soils so that we have something to grow our food in. And so a lot of folks are starting to introduce these conservation tillage methods. So this is contour plowing. You follow the contour of the land to try to avoid a lot of erosion. There are other ways to avoid erosion. Using no-till ag is one of them. So we want to avoid erosion at all costs. It's really important to sustain the human race into the future. Soil compaction can also be a big problem. That happens basically by repeated tilling and running heavy machinery back and forth over the soil. This really decreases the pore spaces between soil particles, and so that really inhibits both gas exchange and water infiltration into the ground, and so it reduces root growth. We won't talk much about phytoremediation, but it's basically a way of, if you've got some toxic pollutants in your ground, you can grow certain plants that will pull these out of the ground, and you're able to then take these plants and dispose of them. And we'll talk a lot about the essential elements that plants need to complete their life cycle, CO2 being one of them out of the air. And we'll also talk a lot about nitrogen and phosphorus. So, the two main categories are macronutrients and micronutrients. Macronutrients are, of course, nutrients that plants need a lot of, and micronutrients are nutrients that plants need a little of. And so, if you use hydroponics and you take away certain nutrients, or what we suppose are nutrients or elements, you can figure out which elements plants actually need and which elements just are sort of along for the ride. And so you can take a look at here. Here's a list of the major macronutrients and micronutrients. And like I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on nitrogen and phosphorus as macronutrients. And we won't talk very much about these micronutrients, but it's important that you know that both macronutrients and micronutrients are important for plant growth, and without them, they wouldn't be able to survive. So I already mentioned the difference between macronutrients and micronutrients, and you were able to see them in the table. So when plants don't have enough of these macronutrients specifically, and sometimes these micronutrients as well, you can actually see these effects in the plants. And so a farmer walking around on their field can actually take a look at their plants and figure out which minerals they might be deficient in. And so here you can see an example from a corn leaf of what phosphate deficiency, potassium deficiency, and nitrogen deficiency might look like. So next time you're out walking in a cornfield, you might want to take a look at a few of those corn leaves and see if you can diagnose some of these nutrient deficiencies. And so there is a way to use genetic engineering to be able to meter your fertilizer usage. We're not going to be talking much about that in class, but just know that it's there. And you can also build resistance to aluminum toxicity, flood tolerance. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. So we're not going to talk about that in this particular class, but it is there. And so with plant nutrition and being able to get the right nutrients that they need in the right ratios, it often involves other organisms in order to achieve this. And so this is what we'll sort of call the soil food web. And so the soil ecosystem is really important to getting the right nutrients into the right places and keep them cycling through the ecosystem. So the area around where the plant's roots are is the rhizosphere, and there's a whole bunch of microbial activity going on around the rhizosphere, and mainly because plants actually release sugars, amino acids, and organic acids into the roots. And just for your information, these are called root exudates. And there's this whole body of research just opening up. We're not even sure how important root exudates are to ecosystems, so there's a lot of these interactions left to be uncovered. But they end up, a lot of links that we have found have been really important. So rhizobacteria, they thrive in this sort of exudate-dominated area around the roots, and they can actually have effects on the plant itself. And so there's good reason why the plant is putting energy into producing these exudates that nourish these bacteria. And so there's a give and take. These bacteria help the plant helps these bacteria. And so you might even want to intentionally introduce these bacteria when you're planting if you want to make sure they're there in order to get the benefits. And bacteria are really important in the nitrogen cycle, and we'll talk a little bit more about the nitrogen cycle here and much more about it in class. And so if we take a brief look at the nitrogen cycle here, we've got N2 gas in the atmosphere. Plants can't use it. When you bring that down into the soil using nitrogen-fixing bacteria, they turn this nitrogen gas into ammonia. And another way you can get ammonia is the organic material, so the dead and decaying plants and animals in the soil. You can ammonifying bacteria get a hold of them, eat them, and one of the byproducts of ammonifying bacteria is ammonia. So you can get ammonia from the atmosphere through nitrogen-fixing bacteria or through organic material, or from organic material through ammonifying bacteria. So once you have this ammonia converts to ammonium in the soil, and plants can take ammonium up directly, but plants also like nitrate, and so nitrifying bacteria will take in this ammonium, and out comes nitrate, and so the plants will use that nitrate as well. And you can actually lose nitrogen from your soil. There's another class of bacteria, denitrifying bacteria. These will take nitrate, turn it back into the N2 gas, back into the atmosphere. So we'll go over this more in class. The nitrogen cycle, pretty important, pretty complex, and another, and so plants like legumes like peas, beans, and other plants, they form a symbiotic relationship with these nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they're pretty important as parts of crop rotation. So on these legumes, you'll have these swellings called nodules, and the nitrogen fixing bacteria will live within these nodules. And so again, the bacteria will be fed from these root exudates, and in return, the bacteria pull nitrogen out of the air for the plant to use. So here you see a good picture of these nodules on the roots. This is a pea plant, and again, so the bacteria in these nodules are pulling nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turning it into nitrogen this plant can actually use, and in return, the plant is feeding these bacteria with its root exudates. And what's pretty cool is these can be pretty specialized systems in that very specific plant bacteria pairings can form. And here's just a close-up look of these root nodules and how they're integrated into the plant. And so like I mentioned before, if you do crop rotation, at least putting in these legumes every other year or every 3 years, then you're able to get some of this nitrogen fixing back so that plants like corn that really needs to use this nitrogen will have nitrogen in the soil for it to use. And so if you grow one of these leguminous crops and you just plow it under and allow it to decompose rather than harvesting it, then that's what's called a green manure. So another plant interaction, organism interaction that we'll talk about with plants here is mycorrhizae. And so mycorrhizae are mutualistic fungi, and their interaction with plant roots. And so the fungus again gets fed these steady supply of sugar, these root exudates coming from the plant, and in return, these mycorrhizae fungi spread out and create this huge surface area over which plants can take up water and take up minerals. And here's some close-up images of the mycorrhizae. There's endomycorrhizae and ectomycorrhizae. So ectomycorrhizae they form and they come around the they form a dense sheath surrounding the root, and they don't penetrate the root cells, but they grow between them and around them. And then endomycorrhizae actually penetrate into the cells themselves. It's again pretty close up look, pretty cool looking. So endo and ectomycorrhizae. So you may want to make sure you have these fungal spores in with your seeds in order to get the benefit of these mycorrhizae. And just as a side note, it's important to know that some invasive species actually stop this interaction from being beneficial, and so you can have invasive species inhibiting this. And there's an experiment done. You can see that with this invasive species, the plant biomass basically looks the same as sterilized soil compared to the uninvaded area. So when you have the invasive species, plant biomass looks very similar to sterilized soil with no mycorrhizae in it. And when you have the regular uninvaded soil, the benefits of these mycorrhizae are just huge. And so these are three different species: sugar maple, red maple, white ash. So they're important, and it's a big difference if they're not. Invasive species can inhibit this beneficial interaction. And so we're not going to talk much about these in class. I just want you to be aware of them. Epiphytes, parasitic plants, carnivorous plants. These are different ways plants sort of get along at surviving. So an epiphyte growing in a tree. Parasitic plants just pull their nutrients directly from their host plant. And here's a non-photosynthetic parasite, so it's relying completely on its host plant instead of doing any kind of photosynthesis. And carnivorous plants, while they do undergo photosynthesis, they get a bunch of extra nitrogen by eating bugs, and so they can live in pretty nitrogen-poor areas. Venus flytrap's a classic example. Like I said, we're not going to be talking much about the carnivorous plants and the parasitic plants, but I just wanted you to be aware of the lifestyle. So hopefully, after taking a look at this slideshow, you're able to talk about what soil texture is and what soil composition is, what soil is actually made of, the important components. Remember, both physical, chemical, and biological. Don't forget the soil ecology. You should know a little bit about the cation exchange. We're not going to worry too much about getting into the specifics. Know that topsoil erosion is a big problem, and then you're going to want to be able to distinguish between macronutrients and micronutrients. What's the difference? And talk about what a nutrient does. We're going to be talking about this more in class. You're going to need to know ammonifying, denitrifying, nitrogen fixing, and nitrifying bacteria. All these bacteria are important in the nitrogen cycle. Crop rotation is an important concept, and ecto and endomycorrhizae. And that's the end of the slideshow. And so, like I said, I've sort of went over this pretty briefly. And so if you folks want to know more, feel free to look up. This is paralleling chapter 37 in your book, so read chapter 37 for more in-depth understanding, and hopefully you've watched the link to the other video that I linked to you folks. And again, go through this presentation and pause on any of the slides that you might have wanted to read more of the text but didn't get a chance to on this video. And so you folks are going to have a quiz on this information when you come to class, and then we'll get right off to the races with applying this information to distinguish the difference between no-till organic agriculture and conventional ag, and some of the important differences there might be as far as soil health.